Hi, I'm Vicky Canning. I'm one of the Associate Directors at Border Criminologies, which is based at Oxford University. And today we're going to start a conversation which will hopefully follow up with various others. We thought we would basically spend some time to think about the key sites of contestation and some of the key issues that are developing in relation to borders, surveillance, and other aspects of social control. So we got talking about what we would like to talk about today and what we're thinking about as the contemporary pandemic starts to impact more and more on all of our lives, and really think about something that Angela Y. Davis said a few weeks ago in a seminar that we had all sort of watched and attended, or a webinar, and that is, what do we do in the aftermath of this? How do we mitigate some of the harms of these kinds of controls and the impacts? And I think her words were, what do we do? How do we make sure that we hit the ground running? So we want to think about some of those things today. We're going to each talk about the key aspects of our research, and for me, maybe activism. I'm going to begin with Mary Bosworth, who's coming in from Oxford. So Mary, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in terms of immigration detention, and in particular why it is important that we empty immigration detention centres?
Okay, thanks, Vicky. So probably everybody who's watching this video will know that one of the main debates that's been happening around the world in response to the COVID pandemic regarding immigration detention, it has been the question of safety within the detention centres and what to do about the illness within the detention centres. And lots of countries, the UK included, have actually responded to the pandemic by emptying their detention centres. Now, in the UK, they're not completely empty, and so we might want to talk a bit about that. But in some countries, such as Spain, they have actually been releasing everybody. And there are sort of two main reasons for that, I think. One is that it is extremely difficult in any custodial site to actually operate a meaningful social distancing program. I mean, of course, the only way you could do it is you could lock people in their cells. And there are all sorts of legal and human rights restrictions on why you can't actually do that. And so otherwise people are going to mix. And we already have loads of evidence that people who are in detention suffer from quite serious medical complaints and are likely to be in a vulnerable category to this particular form of illness. And the other reason, so there's one reason which is about the population and the nature of custodial sites. The other reason is that, of course, no matter how much sites of custody are hidden behind walls and barbed wire and fences, they are, of course, also part of the wider society. And so people come in and out of them. And most obviously, the people who work in these centres. And so given the fact that we don't know enough or anything much at the moment about people's ability to have immunity to this illness, one of the consequences of keeping people in custodial environments where the illness will spread is that it will eventually spread out of those places into the wider community. And so lots of countries have responded to this risk by taking the decision to actually empty them, or at least to significantly reduce the population. And so in the UK at the moment, the last statistic I saw, which I think was from last week, was that there are currently 368 people in detention, down from above a couple of thousand. And of course, not so long ago, there were as many as 4,000 people in detention a few years ago. So this is a massive change, and it does raise the sorts of questions that Vicky began this with, which is questions about what might come next. Is this an opportunity now to think about actually rolling back these institutions altogether and dealing with questions of border control through non-custodial measures?
Do you think that this actually opens opportunities to us discussing seriously the potential for the abolition of immigration detention?
I think it does. I mean, I keep saying this. I'm naturally quite pessimistic, and living through a pandemic is not improving that personal quality. I feel like there's been the possibility of thinking differently about detention for quite some time. I think once the numbers reduced from 4,000 to just above 2,000, I gave a number of talks where I pointed out that sum was basically the equivalent of a high school. And so you could actually imagine doing things quite differently than locking people up. So part of me thinks, well, it's not actually a numbers issue, that the numbers have been low for quite some time, and so there's been capacity for quite some time to think about non-custodial alternatives. I suppose what's changed is that we are now having to have much more of a public discussion about the impact of social inequality on all of society. And so, as we've seen, although we're all experiencing the pandemic, we're not all experiencing the health effects or the financial consequences the same. And I think it has made us really aware that people who previously we might have been tempted to just kind of think of as totally separate from us and really different to us, and therefore people who we could treat quite distinctly to how we would like ourselves to be treated, that actually maybe we can't do that, because maybe if we're treating people in ways that place them, in harm's way, that is also going to place us in harm's way, and that there are actually these kind of collateral consequences. So I think one of the exciting possibilities about what's happening, or what has happened in terms of reducing the population, is that you perhaps don't have to be an abolitionist with all the kind of politics that entails, which not everybody shares, to now think actually maybe we should abolish these places. So it's kind of slightly changed the nature of the discussion, I think, which might have the possibility of drawing more people into it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that the idea of how we see stuff, so the differences between sort of abolitionists and maybe reformists in that context, this does open up a very different discussion in different ways. I think, and we're going to move to Katja Franco next, but because I think that's going to link quite well to thinking about the globalized inequalities of what the experiences are, what death rates are. We're seeing that Black men are 4 times more likely to die at the highest levels of death rates in relation to COVID-19 is, of course, in the poorest areas by at least twice, and the key workers are twice as affected as the general population. So I think that bridges quite well, and we can come back to some of the other points, Mary, that I would probably like to raise about the very existence of immigration detention as something that inherently others and controls people, which I think you've just sort of touched on really well. But we're going to move to Katja Franco, who's just recently released the 3rd edition of Globalization and Crime. And joining us from Oslo, I should have also said.
Thank you, Vicky. And just picking up from Mary's points, I think this discussion, and when we were preparing for this discussion, sort of got me started thinking about the relevance of both the work that I've been doing, but also the perspectives that Border Criminologies has been working on for quite some time now. Sort of, what does this pandemic mean for our understanding of borders? And I think one of the first observations that I have is that basically, in a sense, it increases to an unprecedented level, I think, the legitimacy of borders and border closure as a policy tool. That you might say that before, borders seemed somehow anachronistic in a world that was seen as globalized. The idea that at least people from the Western world would have a sort of free movement, at least Europeans would have it, whereas now borders do not seem anachronistic at all anymore. They have become a very sort of, they have really gained in legitimacy as a policy tool, and we almost seem grateful when the governments sort of indicated they might be opening borders. So it's this complete reversal in how you think about borders and borderliness in a daily life. And I think this partly connects to the sort of the real strengthening of the nation state that we have seen during the pandemic. This is not new. This is a development that has been going on for quite some time, but it has really sort of come into relief in the recent during the crisis. The processes of sort of sorting out membership, where do people belong when the crisis hit, people suddenly sort of rushing to move back to the countries that they might feel might take better care of them, or are their proper countries of belonging, and all these kinds of sorting mechanisms that Border Criminologies has been, and I also in my own work have been describing for some time, is now really sort of come into the forefront. So it is in a sense this resurgence of the nation state and nation state under threat. It might not be so much that it is the national identity under threat through the virus, but it is very much the capacity of the nation state and the capacity that then each nation state needs to take care of itself first and then think about others. So I think that the crisis has sort of really strengthened this, not just national, but also local forms of belonging. We see then, for example, in a affluent country like Norway, the sort of local differences between people in the north and south of the countryside and the city, all these sort of tensions have come up to the front. So where people are then suddenly much more tied to the local. And for this reason, I think the crisis has been, in a sense, described as a process of deglobalization. And when we talked about before this talk, we talked about my third edition of the Globalization book. I actually raised this question about how relevant is it really a few months after it came out. And it does raise quite some very important questions in terms of what do these developments mean? I mean, on one side, it is actually more relevant than ever because COVID is one of the most potent examples of global interconnectedness, of global risk society, of global risk spreading precisely because of mobility and so on, the butterfly effect and so on. But on the other hand, we see really the processes of strengthening of the nation state that have been going on for some time really have come sort of into a much higher gear. And I mean, when I was sort of revising the first edition and then the second edition, this was a challenge, how to incorporate Brexit, Trump, and all this into the book. But now I think this has come to a completely different level. And when it comes to then, what does this mean for what as you were saying? How do we see our frames of action? How does this redefine the political landscape? Obviously, I mean, it may offer opportunities, as Mary was talking about. At the same time, I am also drawn to pessimism, precisely because of this new border framing of the world. That what does it mean for also forms of belonging, for solidarities that go beyond borders? That we have been so drawn into our own localities, that more cosmopolitan forms of belonging that had at least some legitimacy before that are in a sense being even more challenged now than they were before. It opens also spaces of action that are negative in a sense that they make it possible to challenge, for example, international mechanisms like the US retreat from the WHO, these kinds of actions that are, in a sense, very much returned back to the nation and retreat from the global frames of understanding and sort of sharing of burdens. And this is particularly the case when it comes to the EU, when it comes to the refugee situation and so on. So in that respect, I think it does raise some concerns about how do we see frames of action when the world is, in a sense, and deglobalizing, localizing in so many ways as well, and how do we work on that? And if you could, I mean, often the COVID is compared to the financial crisis, but I think perhaps the so-called refugee crisis might be a more sort of more pertinent point of reference, where even though it was also of massive closure wars, at the end it also had many opportunities for belonging, which went beyond borders, which were sort of very much expression of global solidarities. And my question is then, what is happening in this regard now? So yeah, this is just something that we might wish to discuss later on.
I think it's probably quite heartening for anybody who's watching or listening to know that we're all going, oh my goodness, how do we keep up with what's happening? And in particular, I think in a meaningful way. You know, as you say, so much has changed since even the last edition of Globalization and Crime. I'm going to link it just a few things there together, because one of the things I'd like to pick up a bit is the idea of the nation state and how that depends on where you are, the way in which the nation state is actually sort of, you know, acting on behalf of itself or its subjects, in inverted commas, and actually in a kind of a very interesting way. So in the UK at the minute, we're seeing a kind of more of a loss of faith amongst various pockets of society in government and governmentality at the minute, in terms of the response to COVID-19. But that's actually started to fracture what would be a nation state in the context of the United Kingdom into drawing in nation states in terms of devolution. So that only, you know, on Sunday, Nicola Sturgeon went completely against, you know, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister and said, actually, we as Scotland are going to do what we're going to do, and we're going to keep to, you know, to social distance and effectively a form of lockdown. Wales have now started to put up border checks with England to stop tourists coming in. Obviously, that also comes with the idea that you are kind of interestingly bringing disease from England through, and there's been a lot of reports of notes and signage going up saying, you know, don't come here for that reason, in terms of like that kind of protective reason. But also, I mean, for me, coming from Northern Ireland, to see that the DUP have actually rejected who they see as their nation state in the context of this. I mean, that's just totally like flip reversed. I would never have expected that. So I think we are definitely in very interesting times about going forward, or you know, as how we go forward. I also was wondering, because especially those who are, I mean, we're all working on borders in different ways, and I certainly wouldn't compare. I wouldn't compare the experience. A lot of people are saying, you know, this is like a prison. Well, it isn't, because actually we're not subject to the kinds of controls that prison actually has. But I have really reflected a little bit. So for many years I've been writing about autonomy harms and enforced bureaucratized banality as a key way to control, but also sort of encourage or motivate people to leave, as an example, Northern European countries. And those autonomy harms are deliberately designed, I would argue, to make people feel like they can't do anything, they can't afford to go anywhere, even if you are living in an open camp, for example. The actual illusion of, there's an illusion of freedom, which I think actually I'd written about in about 2013 for Border Criminologies in the context of Denmark. And actually, you're seeing now, whenever you speak to people the key thing that people are recognizing is that you can have everything, even if you're in a house. You know, we've seen celebrities complain that they're in lockdown and stuff, is actually what we really value as people is autonomy. So in terms of how we go forward, the use of autonomy is a kind of internalized bordering that impacts on everybody differently in terms of the infliction of these autonomy harms. And I sort of wonder if we can gain some kind of collective empathy with the actual impacts of having your autonomy taken away and out of your hands. So even though you're not, you know, impacted upon by the kinds of state regulations, I certainly wouldn't compare that in the context of, for example, people seeking asylum. I wouldn't compare that at all, because I don't think that actually you can imagine that. But that people may at least start to recognize you can have everything, but actually what you want is, you know, not to be infantilized. You want to have the opportunity to do what you want to do. So I wonder if, you know, those shifts, if there's potential for shifts on, or do you think there is? Do we think there is going to be? Or are we going to see more of these? And maybe actually Sanya can pick this up in a minute, but are we going to see more of these kinds of internalized borderings and, you know, reductions of autonomy? Or might this be the opportunity to say, you know, this is actually harmful on people's mental health. We can see that ourselves. You know, 8 weeks or whatever, 10 weeks, 55 years, who knows? Time has no concept anymore. Into lockdown. Might we change some of these things? So maybe Katja, if you want to sort of think about that in the context of internalized bordering or not.
It's a very good and very difficult question, or at least, I mean, it's a very broad one. But one of the first things that sort of springs to mind to me is that this sort of changed perception of autonomy and our own frame of action, of how sort of broad scope of activity do we see for ourselves. I think it may have several implications. On the one hand, it might have, as also Mary was pointing out, that we do perhaps see greater solidarity with people who have restrained autonomy, that one sort of sees some kind of and that it may have an impact on institutions also, like prisons and detention centers and so on. At the same time, I'm just wondering whether this sort of remarkable closing down of the world and rebordering of the world that has been happening, that in a sense, it also means that we are more willing to accept that people who are far away, people from the global south, will not be coming to the global north, that they will not be part of our societies, that this sort of nation state parceled world becomes a more natural state of mind again, natural understanding of how we see the world. And it would be very interesting to see how, in a sense, whether this has changed our map of how we see the world, really. And I don't know if it would be just less autonomous way, but at least a way where our spans of actions are much shorter, much sort of geographically more compressed. That I don't know, going around Liverpool might be like a big stretch suddenly, whereas before you were going to a conference in the US or whatever. And then how do we see our localities, whether it is then natural to see the presence of people from other parts of the world, let's say from Afghanistan or Syria and so on, whether in a sense they become even more anachronistic in a world where everybody is expected to hold to their own locality. So that might be interesting. And talking about this sort of devolution and border closures within the UK, I mean, Norway had a similar development for a period of time. In April, you know, the north was closing, making borders with the south of Norway, and suddenly you had all these local belongings that became so strong, and the need to protect the local, even within the nation state. So yeah.
One of the things that you've just picked up on, and then we'll go to Sanya, is actually also just maybe think of who we miss. and perhaps again also thinking about how we empathize with people who are miles apart forcibly from people that they love and their, you know, families, friends and partners. And I think that I mean, I opened a talk at Queen's University last year, just sort of saying something similar. Was, you know, I was having lunch with a friend who is from Syria, and I was like, you know, I think it was like March or something, and I was like, oh, I can't wait to get back to Northern Ireland. You know, I miss my mum so much. My mum was in the audience. She came to Queen's. I think that's the first time ever, but anyway. And she's, you know, she's saying, I said, you know, I haven't seen her in like three months, and he was like, oh, that must be really awful. Yeah, I'm really hoping to see my mum too. I haven't seen her in like, I think it was 2.5 years or something. And you of course immediately go, I am such a, you know, such a mug. But it also is a reminder that those, I mean, we can see all the time that those who most need to be able to move are those who are least able to, you know, the passport power index. But you know, I just kind of wonder if, again, in sort of building recognition of the impacts of being far apart, that maybe this is a kind of, again, a social consciousness opportunity to just think, actually, the things that have been, that often people with privilege take for granted, that we now have, again, not even comparing, because actually where there's conflict or where people are stuck at borders, there are many other risks. But for the first time, you know, I'm thinking about, well, what happens, you know, to my mum if something happens and you can't physically go back. And these realities are, of course, not comparable, but in terms of a kind of consciousness or possibility of rethinking how we think about people who are forcibly apart, that maybe we can change the way we approach that, was just something that came up that I was thinking about. But we're going to move now to the last speaker. So Sanja Milivojevic is going to give us, and I think this follows on very well, thinking about civil liberties and rights in the context of tracker apps.
Oh, well, I'm enjoying this so much. I have to be honest. Like, can we do this for 2 more hours? Can everyone just cancel the meetings and we just do this? Thank you, all of you, for the opportunity. And it's sort of fitting, I think, that I am probably the biggest optimist in the group. So I'm going to wrap it up in a nice, fluffy, positive way. No, not this time, I don't think. But anyway, yeah, I've been doing a lot of research on technology and what technology does to us. And when you said to me, can I have a look at that and talk about the tracking apps and civil liberties, I thought, oh yeah, I'm already doing that for the book and it's all going to be just fine. And then I started doing it and sort of looking what's out there, and I completely freaked out. So I thought that I know a lot about it, but actually not really. But, you know, this sort of idea, I just thought to give you a bit of a context first, and then what we have in the UK, and then probably some of my concerns, which are going to be lengthy, but then also the way forward and how we can sort of get out of the situation with the minimum damage. So this sort of idea around contact tracing is nothing new. We've seen it before. We've seen it with Ebola. We've seen it with previous pandemics in particular. But what we see now is a very different constellation where I think something just under 30 countries are now either in the process of already implemented or in the process of developing the tracing apps. Something I would say that it's really quite unprecedented. But in general, there are 2 broad models that countries are going for. One is so-called centralized model, and the other one is decentralized model. And basically, the key difference is that in the centralized model, the data that the technology exchange or gathers about us, our movements, who we see and who we meet, is actually centralized in a database somewhere. And the centralized one is sort of like you know, more localized. So you're keeping it on your device and not necessarily in a central database in a cloud. And this, you know, comes back to what Mary was talking about a bit, but also Katja, in terms of, you know, how the world is changing. So, you know, we've seen the national apps, development of the state-based apps that are controlling the citizens within certain states, right? So, and some of the apps, in particular, Google and Apple model, which is actually a decentralized model, have been trying to rectify that and say, well, we need to think about the future. At one point, we're going to go back traveling, and then, you know, and also this idea that we need to have systems that are compatible with one another. But it's basically a mess out there. But in the UK, the model that we're going for, apparently, even though that's probably changing as well now, is so the UK is going to have an NHS X app, and it's basically going to be a centralized app which have more privacy concerns. But basically how it works is that you'll have the phone, and then on the phone you'll have an app, and the Bluetooth technology is going to be turned on all the time for the app to work. And basically when you meet someone, the phones are going to do a handshake, and they're going to identify the passcodes with one another. There's going to be a data identification exchange between the two. It's called identifier exchange. And then all of that database, so it's going to sort of gather in your phone the list of all the identifiers that you meet. And it's going to stay there for 28 days. And so if you don't really feel sick, and you don't, you know, because the app is going to prompt you to questions, you know, like, how do you feel today? Do you have a cough? Do you have a fever? And you need self-report. And if you do, what's going to happen is basically all of that data is going to be drawn, sent to the cloud, drawn from the cloud to the NHS, and NHS, hopefully, and we don't know who else, is going to have that database. And basically start notifying people that you've been in contact with, and they'll need to go for a test. Now, where do I start with concerns? I think the key concern for me, there are two major ones. The first one is what I call, well, Human Rights Watch actually called, but I also adopted that, necessity and proportionality. So basically, is what we're seeing necessary, and is it proportionate? But the second key question for me is also, what kind of world are we going to live in after this? And I think this is very sort of like what we already seen in Katja and Mary's talk. But basically, for me, there is this big false dichotomy that is happening right now, which is, if you want to be healthy, if you want to be as risk-free as possible, if you want to live in a secure world, then you need to give away more and more of your privacy. And Lucia Zedner, actually, in the talk last week, I think, was talking about this, you know, sort of really interesting idea, how we go from responsible citizens to what she calls conditional citizens, right? So where we need to do all the right things. So give away your privacy, download the app, do the right things, and then you're a responsible citizen, or else, you know. And that sort of idea, I think that everyone is going to be impacted by this. Everyone is going to be under scrutiny. This is sort of, you know, it comes back to that sort of idea that if you see someone gathering down in your neighborhood, you should report it because they're not allowed to. So self-policing all the time, giving away more and more of your agency, I suppose. And this, another thing that I think for me is particularly worrying, and I think the most vulnerable are going to bear the brunt of this. You know, we know who is out there, need to go, need to move around, need to be, and they're going to be mostly under scrutiny. But for me, the final big concern is the mission creep. Where do we stop? How do we make sure that once this system, once the threat is gone, if ever, that these extreme measures are not going to stay in place, that they're not going to, you know, you all know Harari the other day. I freaked out. I actually listened to his podcast. I think it was on BBC Hard Talk with Stephen Sackur, and he was talking about this surveillance under the skin, basically, idea where we see that now the phones are the primary targets of these surveillance strategies, but soon that's not going to be enough. And in fact, you know, we're going to be wearing things that will not be phones anymore, that will be more embedded into our, I don't know, biological bodies, I suppose, is what the world that I'm trying to find out here. But we've seen also in the development of even technology when it comes to phones, this one app that has been developed, which actually, you know, listens to your breathing and actually and records your coughs. And it's been EU funded. It hasn't been deployed anywhere yet, but the very fact that that's already there on a map is something that I think that we should worry. But also, you know, when it comes to mission creep, what's this going to mean for the most vulnerable, like refugees and asylum seekers? We're seeing quite a lot of attempts to police this population in a particular way through the, you know, the very famous Frontex experiment of predictive policing of irregular flows that was disbanded, but also the European Asylum Office had a project that wanted to look at how they use smartphones. And I think, you know, this is where we see in particular how this technology can move forward from what it was supposed to be to, you know, where other applications are. What's me? I'm actually I'm a techno geek, and I think that technology is not going to go anywhere. But I think that we need to be very aware of this techno credulity that we're seeing right now, that technology is the answer for everything. I think machine-human synergy is going to continue, but I think we need to be an important part of that process. So at the moment, we don't see much through that techno fog. Everything is clouded. We don't know how these apps work. We have very little transparency. We can't see the code in many situations. The states are not telling us what data they're recording, etc., etc., etc. That needs to stop. What technology can do for us is technology can empower us to be more aware citizens that are going to make choices, informed choices, and not to remove our agency. This comes back to what Katja was talking about, what Mary sort of suggested at the beginning, you know, and what you actually said, Vicky, as well, about this sort of idea around who we are and how do we behave, and where our agency, where our agency is at the moment and how we can negotiate that. And I think that is the crux of the problem that I see at the moment when it comes to technology and tracking apps. And I'll stop there because I can talk about this forever, but I don't want to. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I actually think that that's really useful, to be honest, because technophobes like myself, who are not techno geeks, you know, the more that you kind of, I think it is useful for people to know actually what is happening and what we're anticipating, because I already see very clearly amongst sort of, you know, friends or colleagues or whatever, well, if it gets us to the end of this pandemic and we're able to have, so it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because for the first time, the concept of giving up forms of civil liberty in the context of these technologies is to gain civil liberties in the context of what we might call real life. So what we might call, I don't know what is real life anymore after all this. So, you know, actually which is preferable. And of course we all say, let's end, you know, we want to end like kind of lockdown. We want to be able to get these civil liberties back, reject this new normal, get back to what we experience as normal in our everyday lives. Although I think definitely we should be rejecting that idea as well and start to think about how we rebuild things much more positively in the aftermath of this. But it does open up really clearly the potential for, you know, state corporate, increased state corporate harms. Definitely under the context of surveillance, as you said, the poorest or specific groups of people in society, so those who are already policed through migration status. But also, you know, the infliction of, for example, fines. So increasing fines. And as you say, Sanya, who's most likely to be on the streets? Well, it's people who are homeless. And I just saw actually already this week, a person who is homeless has been fined because they were moving from one place to the other, that place being no abode. You know, so of course that's part of the broader politics of ever finding people who are in poverty anyway, and the lack of ethics, I think, personally, in that. But, you know, what do we do with that? And I think the question with that comes down to, you know, is there scope to have agreements from states and state, you know, corporate alliances, or the state's own allies in various, even the NHS, for example, as you said, in terms of where the data goes. We don't, you know, is there any way of getting an agreement that this would be, the data that is collected will be, you know, gotten rid of in the aftermath? And I think, again, a little bit like Mary and Katja, I'm probably less than optimistic. But what do you think about that? Do you think that there's even half a you know, point for discussion?
Well, I think you know, I suppose one of the key questions is, you know, we're having crisis, we need to respond quickly, but it's not that this was, I mean, it was unexpected, but we kind of, you know, we kind of knew that this is potentially going to happen at some point in our history. I mean, we need to, I suppose we need to go back to the basics and start thinking about the, you know, the society that we want to live in, and what kind of consequences do we see now because we lived in a society where we didn't have those kind of important conversations. I do believe that technology can actually help a lot, and I think that as I said, we need to work on that human-machine synergy, but we need to do it more proactively, and we need to listen to the experts. You know, this whole idea about everyone is an expert nowadays on everything really gets me. You know, we need to, you know, when people who know a lot about pandemics talk to us as you know, social scientists, then we need to listen, but they also need to listen to us in that sort of conversation. So I think that at the moment we're seeing quite a cacophony of voices where everyone is an expert, but expert voices are not really listened to, and also the ones that are coming through are not necessarily, you know, they're sort of isolated. We have to have a community of people coming together and saying, well, from our perspective, you know, we see this as a problem, and we see this as a problem because we've seen it before. We've seen it before. What happens if you start giving away our civil liberties and human, you know, we say yes to infringement of human rights to certain groups, then other groups are going to come for sure. So this kind of conversation is super important. And yes, I think that they're starting to listen. I think, you know, Google app model, the centralized model, has very, very big, you know, concessions when it comes to some of the concerns raised by the experts, and privacy and human rights and all different, you know, sort of sources of expertise. But I think in general, we need to sort of be very wary of these developments, but also do a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of a scenario writing and foresight approach, I think, is very important here. What we see today, fine, but we also need to prepare and be able to see what happens tomorrow. And I think when it comes to these tracking apps, it's very clear that what comes tomorrow, it might be a bit more challenging than what we thought so far. So we need to think about it. We need to preempt it, and, you know, in the way that we actually think clearly about these issues, and potentially anticipate bad things before they happen. God forbid.
Yeah, I think, well, the point that you've made there, and we can probably wrap this up in the next sort of, you know, 5 minutes or so. But I think one of the key points there is, I mean, I'm probably slightly more critical of the idea of the, you know, kind of the expansion, the potential for expansionism of corporations in this kind of context. It would be sort of one of the things. But in talking about like how we develop afterwards, I think when you said we have had an idea that that this was going to happen, this actually isn't a huge surprise. There was warnings back in sort of November that governments were made aware of, especially I think in the UK it was, you know, January, and still, and even 4 years ago, whenever there was, you know, trials across the NHS about would we be able to respond to a pandemic? No, we wouldn't. And these actions haven't been taken. So in terms of thinking like positively, and I think drawing also back to what Katja said earlier, is how we keep, I don't think we should lose sight of these things in terms of solidarity movements, etc. in the future, because one of the key things that we should be also talking about, I think, in the context of social justice is also accountability. Those who have let us down and have facilitated what you know, Engels would have called social murder. If you can predict these sorts of, if you can predict something like this could have such an impact, then I think actually drawn from the social sciences in terms of that, obviously I would say also Johan Galtung in terms of structural violence. I think that thinking about these things now as this develops while we are in this time, in the context of builds and solidarity, and revisiting discussions about accountability for those who have been most harmed and disproportionately throughout this process. So I think that's one thing to keep an eye on. But actually, you know, I'm always sort of learning from this sort of stuff, because this is definitely very far from my area. But Mary and Katja, is there anything that you wanted to add to that? The one thing I was going to think about as well, which is, now that you've got us thinking about positives, and I think relates a little bit to some stuff Katja's done, is also, Sandra, you said about kind of, you know, going back to basics, and the one thing that has benefited from this has been the environment. And I think in a way we've been for such a long time at saturation point with environmental harms and eco harms and environmental crimes, that maybe this is a way for us to also think differently about that in the context of globalization and crime as well, as we go forward, and be an awful lot kinder, I think, to the planet than we have been. So I mean, not in a kind of, you know, I mean that as a solid sort of reduction of emissions, you know, divestment from fossil fuels, etc. And I think we can all actually play, and even through universities, can play our roles in making those challenges too going forward. So maybe Katja, is there anything that you want to sort of say on that?
Yeah, thank you for the reminder of being sort of there. I think many things to be positive about here as well. And I think what is interesting is how, in a way, the situation may change our map of the world and the sort of maps of action that we can see for ourselves. And I would also like to pick up on what Sanja was saying, that in some ways we have seen this before. And I think this is also interesting, because I think at least Border Criminologies has a lot to contribute when it sort of comes to understanding the patterns of controlling dangerous mobility, that sort of this surveillance of bodies of people that we don't want to move. Now it's everybody that we don't want to move. We would everybody like everyone to be just still at home and don't do anything. But before it was just particular groups of people that, in a sense, there is a lot to learn from this knowledge that we have already. At the same time, it is how to adapt it to this new situation. And actually, in recent weeks and months, I've also been many times reminded of my youth. I grew up in a socialist country in the former Yugoslavia, like Sanja, and in many ways this does remind me of socialism, the sort of the authoritarian state, the state that sort of sees it as its duty to have this population under surveillance, where movement is dangerous, and that sort of uses criminal law to in much more less restrictive way to sort of penalize transgressions. It is a sort of very uncomfortable reminder also of a time before the fall of the Berlin Wall, where sort of to me, I did get a lot of sort of flashbacks to that time. So I think a question might be on which side of the Berlin Wall will the new Europe end up in now? Will we end up in Eastern or in Western Europe, European version? But it's, so I think it is about sort of how does this change our mental maps and of the world and the concepts that we analyze the world with.
And I suppose just to add to that, I guess it seems to me that one of the things maybe we should be thinking of in terms of our research and our activism moving forward would be how to spend more time thinking about the shared connections between everybody. And so, I mean, I was remembering just before this all happened, I was doing some field work in London with escort agents, so with the people who do the deporting, and it was just all starting, and at that stage they hadn't really changed what they were doing, and they weren't informing any of the workers, and they also obviously weren't informing the people who they were deporting. And it did mean that there was this kind of slightly perverse moment where the people whose job was to force people out of the country were actually being made as vulnerable as the people who they were forcing out of the country, at least to this health concern. And they were sort of reflecting on that. And I mean, what would it take to get somebody who's having that thought, who's sort of suddenly realizing that they are, that the job that they're doing is putting them at risk as well as the person who they're forcing out of the country? What would it take to kind of move that self-realization into something else? And so I sort of feel like, I mean, it sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish and a bit, just trying to look for silver linings, but I do think that trying to really take very seriously how this experience has been shared. It hasn't been the same, but it has been shared, and what sorts of possibilities that opens up. Because I think, lots of people are heavily invested emotionally, financially, all sorts of ways in not thinking about other people and not thinking about injustice and just kind of getting on with their lives. And actually everybody's life has been disrupted. So how can we kind of try and work through that and with people to bring them with us to be thinking about alternatives? That might be a task for us, and that's hard for criminologists because what we're really good at is pointing out the problems. And so can we reorient ourselves somehow to not just be thinking about the problems, but to be actually trying to think creatively and collaboratively about ways forward?
I think, sorry, Sanya, you were gonna.
This is when Mary was talking, I was thinking, it's almost like a new solidarity kind of movement, in a sense. But it's interesting because I don't know, like it's philosophically, this is really, it's almost like, completely juxtaposed. You have these sort of ideas about, coming back to the local, and yet we're looking for something like a global approach. I think it's doable. I really do. But I also think that we need to be less picky about who our allies are going to be in this process. And I think, I don't know, Mary, if I understood you correctly, that's sort of what you maybe are hinting at as well. And as criminologists, I think we need to maybe change that criticism mindset. It's so easy to say, that this app is just rubbish and it can do this fine, but we need to start looking a bit more about how we can flip the narrative and come with solutions, and just say, well, okay, but also forward thinking is the key, really. Like, what is the world that we want to have? What are some of the key premises? Where are the red lines? And how we can help get there, I think, is the key. And we have a lot to offer.
I mean, I think that this is true. I think this is fundamental to sort of activist approaches to the social sciences, which I get criticised for by various sections of criminology. But actually, I think that if we do this with, so while you say Sanya, with creating allies. I think that creating allies to mitigate harm is one thing, if we are always still conscious of co-option. And I think that the key is recognizing what co-option looks like and how we avoid it. But, you know, as an example, at the European Group for the Study of Deviance and Social Control, so I co-coordinate that, and last year that's what we said. So I wonder if in the aftermath of this, in a kind of an academic sense, so last year we said, come with papers, but come with what you've done and what can be applied, what has worked well, and what have, you know, you failed miserably at. I certainly have been able to, you know, tally up enough of, you know, what has definitely not worked well, and, you know, but also some of the things, and actually having those discussions, and having a starting point of what has been done, or what can be done, or what would be the best outcome, also then means that you can go away from places thinking, oh, this is the person that we can actually do to, you know, I can work with to make this sort of stuff happen. And I think that in the aftermath of this would be a really great way of moving forward and thinking about the starting point being, let's talk about what works, what doesn't work, and what we'd like to see work. And that worked really well last year, and I think, you know, there's real potential for that across many other arenas. But I'm aware that I think we're up towards our R, and our R, there's my Northern Irish that's come back out, our hour. Yeah, it's, I think that what we've done here is hopefully started some points of conversation. We really want to think about, you know, as, you know, again, to quote Angela Y. Davis again, how do we hit the ground running? What do we need to consider? What sort of changes do we want to make? And how do we take part in, you know, solidarity movements or other kind of movements to try and make that happen? So hopefully this will be the first of a few conversations. And I think I'll give a round of applause, since we're not in real life. I'll give a round of applause to Mary, Sandhya and Katja for excellent presentations. And it's been really nice to see everybody. And otherwise, hopefully everybody keeps safe, and we'll update more on Border Criminologies as we develop.